What makes something monstrous? At first, the answer seems obvious. Monsters are the creatures lurking in the dark, the killers, ghosts, demons, and the things that go bump in the night. But horror has never really been about monsters. It's about fear. And more specifically, it's about who society chooses to fear.
I am Dracula.
Throughout the history of horror cinema, monsters have acted as containers for cultural anxieties. They give shape to fears that are difficult to talk about directly. Fear of outsiders, fear of change, fear of social instability, fear of the unknown. And few ideas have been more deeply connected to horror than the idea of the other. The person or group defined as different from what society considers normal. For decades, horror often positioned racial difference within this framework. Blackness, foreignness, and cultural difference were frequently coded as threatening, dangerous, or unknowable. The monster became a way of reinforcing social boundaries. But something interesting happens in contemporary horror. Films like Candyman and Get Out don't simply ask us to fear the monster. They ask a different question. What if the monster was never the racialized other at all? What if the real horror lies in the systems that create monsters in the first place? Monsters don't emerge from nowhere. Every era creates the monsters it needs. The vampire reflects anxieties about sexuality and contamination. The zombie often appears during moments of social collapse. The slasher emerges from fears surrounding morality, adolescence, and violence. The monster is never just a creature. It's a cultural symptom. And because societies organize themselves through ideas of normality and difference, monsters often become attached to people who exist outside dominant social norms. In Western culture, whiteness has historically occupied the position of the invisible default. It becomes associated with safety, rationality, and normality precisely because it rarely has to identify itself. Everything else becomes visible by comparison. Everything else becomes different. And horror has frequently translated that difference into threat. But contemporary horror increasingly turns this relationship inside out. Instead of treating racialized bodies as monstrous, these films ask why certain bodies were ever considered monstrous in the first place. No film demonstrates this shift more clearly than Candyman. When Candyman was released in 1992, it looked like a familiar urban horror story. A ghostly killer, a housing project, and a series of brutal murders. At first glance, Candyman appears to embody a long history of racialized horror imagery, the dangerous black man haunting a neglected urban space. But the deeper the film goes, the more that image begins to unravel. Because Candyman wasn't born a monster, he was made into one. His origin story reveals a black artist murdered by a racist mob after falling in love with a white woman. His body is mutilated, tortured, and burned. The monster isn't the source of violence, he's the result of it. This changes the entire meaning of the film. Candyman's return isn't simply supernatural, it's historical. He's less a ghost than a wound. A reminder that certain histories never truly disappear. The film constantly reinforces this idea through its visual style. Rather than relying on sudden jump scares, director Bernard Rose creates a dreamlike atmosphere, filled with slow camera movements, lingering transitions, and a sense that the past is bleeding into the present. Even Philip Glass's score feels mournful rather than frightening. there's tragedy beneath the terror. The setting of Cabrini Green works in a similar way. The decaying buildings and neglected infrastructure don't simply create an unsettling atmosphere. They become evidence of larger histories of segregation, poverty, and abandonment. The horror isn't just happening inside the space itself has become haunted by history. And that's what makes Candyman so powerful. The film understands that monsters are often created through acts of exclusion and violence. At the same time, it remains deeply uncomfortable. Candyman is still visually coded as frightening. The film still draws on imagery historically associated with racial fear, which creates a tension running throughout the entire movie. Candyman both critiques racialized monstrosity and participates in it. And that contradiction might be exactly the point. Because the film isn't showing us a monster, it's showing us how monsters get made. If Candyman is about the return of historical violence, Get Out is about something quieter, something more familiar, something hiding in plain sight. Jordan Peele's film begins with a situation that feels almost mundane. Chris, a young black photographer, travels to meet his white girlfriend's family. At first, the Armitages seem harmless, awkward maybe, overly eager to demonstrate how progressive they are. But that's exactly where the horror begins. Because Get Out understands something crucial. Racism doesn't always announce itself through hatred. Sometimes it appears through fascination, through admiration, through desire. The Armitages don't fear blackness. They want it, they admire it, they consume it. And that's what makes them terrifying. The central horror of Get Out is not exclusion, it's possession. The film's most disturbing idea arrives through the coagular procedure, which allows wealthy white people to transplant their consciousness into black bodies. It's a horrifying concept because it transforms blackness into a resource, something to be occupied and harvested, something valuable only once ownership has been transferred elsewhere. Peele visualizes this dynamic through the sunken place. It's one of the most memorable images in modern horror. Chris drifts backward into an endless void, trapped behind his own eyes, forced to watch events unfold without control. The sequence turns social powerlessness into something physical, something we can feel. And throughout the film, Peele builds tension not through monsters hiding in shadows, but through uncomfortable conversations, lingering pauses, and subtle social interactions. The danger isn't lurking outside the house, it's built into the structure of the house itself. This is where Get Out fundamentally transforms horror. Traditionally, horror locates fear in the outsider, the stranger, the other. But Peele relocates fear to the center, to the people who appear normal. The monster isn't a single individual, it's an entire system, a network of behaviors, assumptions, and power relations operating beneath the surface of everyday life. And that's why Get Out feels so unsettling. Because it reveals that the most frightening monsters are often the ones society refuses to recognize as monsters at all. What connects Candyman and Get Out is that both films fundamentally rethink where horror comes from. For much of horror history, racialized people were positioned as sources of fear, as outsiders, threats, and monsters, but these films reverse that logic. Candyman reveals monstrosity as the afterlife of racial violence. Get Out exposes the structures of power that continue to consume and control under the appearance of progress. In both cases, the monster turns out to be something larger than any individual character, whether it be a history, a system, or an ideology. And that's what horror does at its best. It doesn't simply show us monsters. it reveals the fears that created them. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing isn't what's hiding in the dark. It's the thing we've been taught not to see.